Okay, John, I will try and share the first slide, so bear with me. Okay, can you see your slide?
Yeah, I can see it.
Great. So thank you very much and welcome, John. Please
Uh,
tell me when you want to change the slide, okay?
I will. Thank you. Well, thank you, Lou. Thanks to APPA. Thanks for everyone who's tuning in. It really is a privilege to present to you today. As Lou said, my name's John Tambornino. I'm relatively new to APPA and philosophical counseling, 2 years now, but I have another form of philosophical practice that I've developed over a 15-year period, and that's what I'd like to talk about today. What I'm going to do is summarize a paper that's forthcoming in the journal. The title, Before You, Finding Our Way About Philosophical Practice in Religious Community. And my hope is that the talk today and the paper is going to help us understand new opportunities for philosophical practice and just different ways of thinking about philosophical practice and philosophy itself, and religion for that matter. Next slide. So what I'd like to do is present an overview of the paper, then I'll talk about the philosophical orientation that's animating this work to a great extent, talk at some length about the context, and I'll explain why it's important that I talk about the context at length, describe the practice itself, at least parts of the practice, and then end with some reflections and further questions. For some of the slides, I'm going to allow you just to read them yourself, as opposed to reading them to you. But if there's anyone who has difficulty reading them for whatever reason, then I can certainly read them aloud. Next slide. So this is the abstract for the paper. And as I said, just please take a second to take it in. So it's ambitious as in its scope, I suppose, and I'll let you be the judge as to how successful I am in this ambition. What I want to do now is to share with you a philosophical remark that, as much as anything, captures the way I think about philosophy and the way I'm thinking about it in this practice. Next slide. A philosophical problem has the form, I don't know my way about, from Wittgenstein in the Investigations. This remark conveys what I regard as the essence of philosophy and the experience of philosophy. It captures the immediacy, the honesty, the uncertainty, the humility, and often the anxiety, as we were discussing, associated with philosophy and the being perplexed, struggling. It presents philosophy as what occurs when we pause, when we're not sure of our way about or of our way forward. It emphasizes in part the practical need for clarity and orientation and direction. It conveys the ordinary quality of philosophy, presenting it as something that everyone does pretty much every day. Again, just orienting ourselves, making sense of a situation, finding direction, assigning value. It presents philosophy as a situated practice, as something that occurring in a particular context by particular individuals and communities. And again, it is, in short, philosophy is finding our way. Sometimes this is finding our way in, sometimes our way forward, and sometimes a way out. We were talking this morning about roadmaps, and that is similar to what I'm talking about here, I suppose. I should say that in invoking Wittgenstein, I'm not claiming that he would be enthusiastic about my practice. He was notoriously pessimistic regarding the impact of that philosophy could have. He sharply distinguished philosophy from religion, viewing religion sometimes as the realm of the mystical or inexpressible, sometimes as a separate language game not governed by science or reason, sometimes characterizing it as passionate conviction rather than rational belief, sometimes emphasizing that religion is not a doctrine but rather a way of being. and other views. Nevertheless, I consider what I'm presenting here to be broadly Wittgensteinian in orientation, but that's ultimately not my purpose to interpret Wittgenstein, but rather just to explain the ways in which some of his remarks have inspired me. I should say Sarah Ellenbogen has a very nice paper on the application of Wittgenstein to philosophical counseling in the journal, I think 2006, that I enjoyed reading, and I consider it broadly consistent with my understanding of Wittgenstein here. This Wittgensteinian conception of philosophy has given rise to my philosophical practice in a particular religious community. It's a community where we frequently pause to find our way about. Indeed, the purpose of the community is to help members find their way through life and for the community itself to find its way through the world. To this extent, the community is implicitly philosophical. And the practice that I have developed over the years has aimed to make this philosophical dimension explicit. Given the conception of philosophy that I'm emphasizing as a situated practice of particular individuals in particular situations, I need to say how I found my way to this space and to this practice. I was raised in a staunchly secular environment. My father was a scientist. He was hostile to religion. He was fleeing Catholicism, which he'd been raised in. That's one of the reasons I pursued philosophy, wanting answers, wisdom, meaning, and that led me to just have an intuitive interest in philosophy when I was young, and eventually then to academic philosophy in college. And like so many people, my experience of academic philosophy was mixed. At many moments, it was truly exhilarating, but just as often it was disappointing. It was dry, it felt technical, it was overly technical, unconcerned with the basic question of how to live a life. And this led me to really feel kind of homeless, that religion was off limits. I had just a profound animus toward organized religion, even though I knew nothing about it. Philosophy wasn't quite satisfying me, academic philosophy. Popular culture seemed so devoid of the reflection and dialogue that I was seeking. So I spent many years really feeling like I simply wasn't getting what I needed. And I eventually began to glimpse that the kind of ethical and existential reflection that I was seeking was occurring in houses of worship. Not all of them, but some of them, as I was discovering. And I eventually found myself in a Unitarian Universalist congregation. So I'm going to talk now about that religious tradition and faith of Unitarian Universalism. Next slide. So Unitarian Universalism was founded in 1961. It's a liberal religious denomination, not only in the US, but especially in the US. It's humanist, it's loosely interfaith. It originated in two older liberal Christian denominations in the US. The first being the Unitarians, which were officially founded in 1819. They denied the Trinity, hence Unitarianism. They believed that all humans were made in the image of God, not just Jesus. Prominent Unitarians included Jefferson, Adams, William Ellery Channing, he was the founding theologian, Emerson, Thoreau, Margaret Fuller, Frederick Douglass. They were elites by social status. I mean, New England got like Harvard. The Massachusetts government was a theocracy in some ways. It was all Unitarian, and at one point, I believe you had to be Unitarian to be on the board of Harvard. So they were elites socially, but they had an egalitarian vision, and this was based in part on their theology. They believed that every individual had what they called powers, not in an overly kind of mystical sense, but just the ability, faculties to develop intellectually, aesthetic, spiritually, such that every individual could have their own truth, their own sense of the divine. And they called this self-culture, this notion of cultivating the inner life. And it was a radical claim that everyone could do it, the farmer, the mechanic, etc., the blacksmith. Their egalitarianism led them to be on the forefront often of movements to abolish slavery, establish universal public education. They were especially instrumental in that, promoting women's suffrage. By the early 20th century, they had evolved into a religious humanism, emphasis on the humanism, very rationalist. They largely rejected God, rejected any traditional notion of revelation. They were committed to the good life in the Aristotelian sense, to social progress in a fairly liberal sense. So that's Unitarianism. And then the sister tradition was Universalism. That appeared in 1790. They opposed Calvinism, which was dominant at the time in New England. Calvinism, among other things, posited predestination, that is, certain people were going to go to hell. It was decided in advance, even before you were done living your life. We were in the first half of life, as it were. Instead, the Universalists believed that God was loving, that his love was inclusive, that salvation was something everyone would experience, hence universalism. And their values included both these biblical values of peace and fellowship, but also Enlightenment values of reason and progress and that sort of thing. Next slide. So UUs are known for what they don't believe, what they reject, what they question. They don't believe the Bible is the Word of God. Indeed, most Unitarians don't believe in God or use the term. Very few believe in the supernatural, which raises the question of, well, what do they believe and what are the bases of those beliefs? So UUs have formulated a set of sources, and these are just encouraged as sources of reflection and inspiration, none of which are mandatory. And again, I'll just give you a moment to read through those. So all of these sources have some resonance with philosophy. We see notions of transcendence, wonder, wisdom, etc. It's the humanist source that I've italicized that's the most explicitly philosophical in commending reason, opposing dogma, that sort of thing. For many Unitarians, this is their favorite and first and to some extent only source. There is a strong commitment typically to critical rationalism. There's a skepticism regarding everything ultimately. The spiritual orientations could be described as non-theistic, that sort of thing. So those are the key sources of belief that UUs emphasize. And these lead then, to some extent, to a set of principles. Next slide. So again, take a moment just to take these in. Again, they all have some resonance with philosophy. The fourth is the most explicitly philosophical, emphasizing freedom of thought, search for truth and meaning, philosophical reflection, basically. We see classical liberalism, which has really influenced UU. We see Stoicism, the ideal of world citizenship and cosmopolitanism, particularly in the first, the emphasis on the worth and dignity of every person. But back to the free and responsible search for truth and meaning and philosophical reflection, that's really part of the UU faith. There's this commitment to ongoing reflection and exploration. There's the belief that individuals are responsible for their beliefs. They need to be able to articulate their beliefs, to defend their beliefs. For young people who are interested, who are being raised UU, they go through a coming of age experience when they're 17, 18, where they actually put on paper over a period of several months of discussion and discernment, put on paper what their beliefs are, what their commitments are, and then express those to the community. So again, the idea is that if you're going to be Unitarian as an adult, you need to be able to articulate and defend and explain what it is you believe and to continue to be in that mode of doing so. So to that extent, I would say that it's not a cult, per our discussion this morning. It's not a cult in part because people leave all the time. Sometimes their critical reflection leaves them out the door, and that's seen as itself kind of a natural process. Okay, finally, let me just talk about the context in which my practice is occurring, and that's a particular church. Next slide. So it's at a church, All Souls Church Unitarian in Washington. It's 200 years old. It's large, it's urban, it's diverse, it's educated, it's progressive, it's got a rich history. Emerson preached his first sermon there. Frederick Douglass was a member there. Other sorts of luminaries are associated with it. Its vision statement, which the congregation adopted in 2009, I helped to write this, which is one of the reasons I like it, includes this statement. This is the beginning of the vision statement. All Souls Church cultivates and celebrates spiritual growth and transformation as we question, learn from others, and seek lives of meaning and reverence. So it's encouraging, it's embracing a philosophical ethos of critical inquiry, individual reflection, dialogue across diverse beliefs, and it's conducive to philosophical practice, to the practice that I've developed, to which I now turn. Some of you, this may not be a moment too soon, so next. Okay. Let me just give you an overview of my philosophical practices at All Souls. These are a series of complementary philosophical practices that have emerged organically. All have been done in a volunteer capacity. The first, which is what I'm going to emphasize today, is leading a monthly discussion group called Philosophical Souls. The next is a group called Stopping to Think, which is a covenant group, which means a group of about a dozen people who commit to meet together monthly or regularly over a year at least to discuss just common spiritual concerns. I've taught seminar-like courses on philosophy and theology, Plato, Aristotle, Greek tragedy, Paul Tillich, which is one of my greatest influences for this work in addition to Wittgenstein, Reinhold Niebuhr, other thinkers. I led a weekend retreat entitled Philosophy as a Way of Life. This was inspired in part by Pierre Hadot's portrait of Hellenistic philosophy as having a quasi-religious character, as encompassing all of life, as a series of practices that occur in community. This was just a profoundly rewarding experience. It was life-changing for some of the participants. It occurred right before COVID, and were it not for COVID, we would have done it at least once again since then. I've conducted some workshops, sort of half-day workshops on salient ethical concerns or dilemmas confronting the community, and I've begun to offer philosophical counseling to congregants on a pro bono basis. So let me now talk about Philosophical Souls at greater length. This is the mission statement of Philosophical Souls. I'll let you read it. Okay, next slide. So let me just talk about some of the brass tacks of the group before I reflect on it more philosophically. We meet monthly, very often in my living room. It's a 90-minute formal discussion preceded by wine and cheese, followed by lingering conversation for those who want to linger. The topics are announced in advance to the congregation, require RSVP. We limit it to 12 people. Usually get 10 to 12, occasionally go over if people are just begging to participate, even though we're already at the limit. We do not require advanced reading. That's often a question. Rather, the facilitator, me, does read typically in advance, at least collects my thoughts, my thinking, and offering a brief introduction, framing the topic, offering key questions, guiding the discussion, though flexibly guiding it. The limited structure is part of the magic of the discussions. It really allows unanticipated thoughts, directions, novel insights, new questions that emerge. We begin the meeting with personal introductions, most importantly, why the person is drawn to the topic. And that itself is the beginning of the discussion of why we think it's an important topic. We emphasize what we loosely call the art of listening. And that is the discipline of listening, of really focusing, concentrating on what one another is saying, giving one another our full undivided attention. This is, I think you would agree, a pretty rare experience in today's world of multitasking and distraction and all the rest. But that's the idea, that this is an intense experience of total focus. When I say distractions are not allowed, that means smartphones and whatnot are kind of banned. Just total focus on what one another is saying, allowing moments of silence just for that form of digesting what's been said. And this really makes it special. This is why people are showing up, because it's offering a rare experience of such intense dialogue and really being listened to and listening to one another. Some of the topics we've covered, next slide. So a range of concerns, some of which are some of the most perennial philosophical concerns, of course, of justice and freedom and that sort of thing. We select topics as we go. This has several advantages. Often the topic is selected based on kind of where the discussion ends in the meeting we've just had. This gives it a natural continuity. It creates kind of a collective investment in the topics. People want to return to continue the conversation. The discussions have a personal quality. So a lot of these are topics that are discussed in academic seminars appropriately, but that's not exactly the way we're discussing it. We're really appreciating the sensitive nature of many of these topics and approaching them not simply as abstract puzzles, but as deeply personal issues. We do very much allow ourselves to be fascinated by just the abstract complexity of these topics, but we also recognize just how personal they are. And therefore, the discussions can have a very poignant quality, often a very unsettling quality. We're admitting that we don't really know what love is, and we're struggling to articulate what that means, and admitting that the stakes feel enormous. They are enormous. So there's a sensitivity and there's a solemnity for many of the topics because the stakes are so high. Let me talk about a few of the topics in depth. This is a meeting. Next slide. Yes, thank you. This was a meeting that we did late last spring, right at the beginning of COVID, entitled The Costs. I'll read this one. COVID-19 is costly, costing lives and livelihoods, closeness and community, liberty and privacy, and much more. How can we account for and come to terms with these costs? How can we weigh these costs when it comes time to choose between them? Are there safe treasures that can help us endure these costs? Can we imagine getting beyond this crisis, not simply poorer, but also richer? So we chose this topic, I chose it, responding just to the feeling that, of course, we were all feeling, of feeling overwhelmed by the novelty and the enormity of the challenge we were suddenly faced with. It was a virtual meeting by necessity, the first virtual meeting. It had an unusually somber tone. Many themes emerged in the discussion. This included Stoic themes of accepting hardships imposed by an indifferent universe. Discussed utilitarianism, its relevance, given that we were suddenly having to think about individual behavior in a calculating way regarding its potential effects on global welfare. We didn't resolve any issues, really. Many new questions arose in addition to the questions we started with. But by the end, everyone was in a different state. I certainly was. We felt less alone, less muddled, less anxious, better prepared to make the hard decisions we were going to have to make. In short, it was philosophy as consolation, as Boethius conceived it when he was experiencing his own version of a stay-at-home order, namely being in a dungeon for a crime he didn't commit, and found consolation in philosophy, in a synthesis of Stoicism and Platonism. Next slide. This is taking on a socio-political issue of capitalism. I'll let you review that. So it's the sort of philosophical topic that one could spend a semester on. Indeed, I have spent a semester on it in an academic setting. But we were wanting to approach it from a more personal perspective, from the inside, if you will. That is beginning with the reality that we're living in capitalism, and to some extent, we're all capitalists. We have capital if we're lucky. We spend it, we invest it, we buy things, we sell our labor. So rather than something that's common on the left, and that is kind of lazily denouncing capitalism, we were wanting to just come to grips with the fact that we are part of it and we enjoy aspects of it, even if there's other aspects that we find deeply objectionable. So this was really challenging the reflexive progressivism or leftism of members. As I said, it's a very progressive church. Pretty much everyone's on the left and in somewhere on the left of the political spectrum. So it was good to challenge ourselves to really do something other than just denounce capitalism, but rather acknowledge its virtues and think about the extent to which those are things we would not give up. Talked about core issues of freedom, fairness, inequality, the role of government, really emphasized the advantages of capitalism, not just instrumental, but intrinsic, the ways in which it encourages freedom, reciprocity, trust, sort of thing that Adam Smith emphasizes so eloquently, Milton Friedman, other contemporary figures. And we came away with an appreciation of its inherent advantages and limitations, which is not to say that was the goal necessarily. It was not to paper over its problems, but rather to be more honest in our assessment of it. To that extent, it was doing what Rawls considers to be a primary aim of political philosophy, and that is to become better reconciled to a social order that we inhabit. That is, if warranted, if following reflection, we conclude that a social order or a social institution is basically just or can be rationally justified, that allows us, Rawls says, to affirm our world, to embrace it, rather than simply be resigned to it. And that's a very, very different state of being, and that's a very different stance as a citizen. Of course, it's not always warranted, as he would say and as I would say, but when it is warranted, there's something very liberating about being able to feel more reconciled to one's world, the basic structure, as he would put it, of one's world, rather than sort of resigned to it in kind of a bitterness or detachment. Next slide. This is the third and final example I'll share. I'll let you read that. So we chose this topic after we'd become quite established in the church. And we did it because we thought in good philosophical fashion, rather than get too complacent, we needed to think hard about what our purpose was and what our value was. That is, we wanted to step back from the group itself and think about why are we doing what we're doing? What is it we're contributing? And what is it we're unable to contribute? So we wanted to explore the practical value of philosophy, think about its role in the good life and as part of a spiritual life. The discussion focused a lot on the aspiration of rationality, of a kind of a transparency of the self in terms of rational explanation and justification of belief, the Socratic impulse to kind of extend reason all the way down, as Bernard Williams puts it. Talked about the benefits of this in enabling a certain form of clarity and autonomy, but also the costs of this, the ways in which it can extinguish potentially mystery and mysticism and that sort of thing. And we followed this with the topic, why theology, to ask the same questions about what the purpose of theology was and to think about what's distinctive about theology of pursuing wholeness, whereas philosophy might ultimately want wholeness, but it very often doesn't get there. It's much more interested in exposing, gaps, questions, those sorts of things. Next slide, please. Well, why does it work? We're convinced it works, given that it's been so popular for so long. A variety of reasons. The participants tend to be very well educated. This allows esoteric references to philosophy and the humanities and social sciences more broadly. but we try to be accessible to everyone, regardless of their education level. It's diverse in age, spiritual orientation, religious history, life experience. A number of the participants are fairly regular. This gives it continuity. Almost all of them attend the church. This allows common reference points, shared community concerns, a similar ethos, and importantly, a commitment of trust and respect that's part of being a member of the congregation. The group is flexible. People attend only when they're interested, purely voluntary. I'm only there for that matter because I'm wanting to do it. I'm interested in that topic. And that means everyone is there because they are seriously concerned with the topic. And that's really, again, what can make it just give it such vitality that we're all so strongly interested in the topic to devote an evening to it. Many participants say they find this experience more rewarding than what they experienced in their liberal arts educations, simply because it's purely voluntary. You're not doing it in part to pass the course and get a credit and all those sorts of things. As I said, we choose topics as we proceed. This just allows them to emerge naturally, to select topics that are resonant, that are timely for the community. And choosing topics itself is an important philosophical exercise of discernment, of thinking about where is philosophical attention most warranted. Next slide. Okay, some challenges. One is that the ambiance, given the way I've described it, is being one where we're really practicing listening and just very careful expression. And this discourages more aggressive interrogation, more combative intellectual engagement, those who really delight in that. Not to say that never happens, but we kind of discourage that. We want it to be, in some ways, more humble of dialogue, of really listening and expressing one's thoughts, again, engaging critically, but not competitively, not trying to win the argument, not constantly being in the mode of preparing a refutation as someone speaking. The sensitivity of the topics, that's a challenge, and that we have to tread softly, as I said, when discussing certain topics. But again, that's a strength. It encourages careful expression. As I said, most of the participants are politically progressive in some way. This really is a challenge. It can lead to dogma. It can lead to unquestioned assumptions. But the point of the group is to provide a space for open, critical reflection. It's why we're there, to question the ideological orthodoxy of the society in general, but of the community. Also, regarding issues of orthodoxy, the sources and the principles that I displayed, these are seen as a reference, as a resource. They're not regarded necessarily as self-explanatory or as adequate. We often press upon those beliefs. So they're not seen as sacred in the sense of they're just sort of provide this unquestioned foundation. Next slide. What is it not? It's not worship in the familiar sense of kneeling before a higher power, but it could be considered worship in the sense of a practice of reverence. That is reverence for dialogue regarding truth and meaning. It's not teaching in one sense, in the sense of a teacher who is kind of unilaterally imparting knowledge to the students. The facilitator is struggling with the questions as much as anyone and is learning just as much. It's not Socratic in the one sense of leading the pupil to a particular answer, nor of sort of thinking we're going to arrive at this sort of Platonic form of this single kind of adequate or permanent definition of a topic like justice. Even if that were the goal, we have never arrived at such an adequate and complete definition. The goal is to appreciate the complexity of the topic, to identify the uncertainty, and often we find ourselves appreciating the ambiguity and the elusiveness of the topic as much as we find ourselves being satisfied with any particular definition or construal of a topic like justice. It's not about reinforcing doctrines. As I was saying, the only shared belief is one of a shared commitment to open-mindedness and intellectual honesty. That's the one thing that we all believe. And finally, one thing it is what UUs refer to as shared ministry. In UUism, members are expected to find ways to minister to the congregation. And this is a form of ministry in that it's satisfying the need of many congregants for this sort of serious reflection and dialogue regarding the most fundamental concerns. Next slide. Well, given the situated conception of philosophy that I have emphasized of occurring in a particular community, philosophical practice of this sort will be different depending on the particular religious community it might be tried in. Many religious communities, no doubt, are less conducive to philosophy. They don't have quite the explicit philosophical ethos that UU does in many ways. But nevertheless, if one is in a religious community and identifying where there's space for philosophical reflection and probing, itself is, of course, an important philosophical exercise. The practice, no doubt, would have to, go back, Lou. The practice would have to be adapted in some ways to, depending on the community, there'd be other constraints, but potentially other openings. I would hope a religious community would see this as not a threat, but rather something that can bring depth and vitality to belief through this more reflective exercise. General questions that apply in my practice, in my context, but I think these are more generic questions. These have surfaced for me. These include the relationship of philosophy to religion, theology, and spirituality, the relationship of doubt to faith, the extent to which a sacred text can be read as a philosophical text, the nature of worship and ritual, and the extent to which philosophical reflection and dialogue can be regarded as worship or ritual, the epistemic challenges in dialogue across diverse beliefs, the ethos appropriate for such dialogue, the practical nature and value of philosophy, and the role of philosophy in the spiritual life and in a good life. I'm hoping to explore these questions in future writings, but I will continue to explore them through philosophical practice because, as Wittgenstein also remarked, next slide, philosophy is not a theory, but an activity. Next slide. Thank you so much. I really look forward to your questions right now, or if you'd like to follow up by emailing me, that's how you can get a hold of me. And Lou, you can remove the slides.
Okay, John, thank you so much.